Hello everyone, Master Xeon1001 here, and in this video we'll be talking about some of the improvements that have taken place for HardOps 987_12. The real stars of this release is Everscroll, which has now been transitioned over to the .ui, and the new addition of set origin, which will now allow users to set origin using a system similar to the placement dots that are in Boxcutter. And this one is a big addition, and a lot of work has went into it, and I'm quite proud of the work that everyone has done for this, especially Loof and Steve. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. So here we are using a previous HardOps in a previous version of Blender. Under the HardOps button, you can go to the drop down, and under the opt-ins, you can choose to have your Array V2 start you off in Array V2 in 3D mode. So if we were to draw a shape, shift live, and we look at it from the side, and we press Q and we go under Array, and we attempt to move it, we see that we're not able to move it despite being on the correct axis, and we end up having to rotate the view in order to move it. This is something that I know is completely avoidable in 3D mode, and it's just been variable, so it's something that we also want to resolve once again in this update. So by jumping over to the current version, where I'm using HardOps 987.12, we'll just draw a box with Boxcutter, shift to live, look at it from the side, and under the HardOps button, we just want to make sure that we're under Array V2 under 3D. And whenever we press Q and we use 3D, we can press X and change the axis, and we see that we're now able to manipulate this from an orthographic view. Not a big deal, it's just something that was supposed to have been done last version, but there was unfortunately some sort of mishap that caused it to be an issue. Here we are looking at a top view. We're able to add another array, press X to change our axis and move it in 3D view, and then move out, and we see that everything's performing as expected. Another concept about the array worth discussing is the dead zone circle. So basically we have this array already set up with this object. If we press Q, we go into Array V2, we see that the cursor has a circle around it. And basically the moment that I move the cursor outside of the circle, it breaks the circle and I begin adjusting the array. And the purpose of the dead zone circle is to allow users to have a moment inside of array to either press tab and bring up their UI in order to go and make adjustments that way, which allows you to break the circle because it pauses the experience, or to allow you to go inside of array and just quickly adjust the count without disrupting the distance at all via mouse movement. It would be kind of traumatic if every time you went inside array it began adjusting it automatically based to your cursor, and that's the reason that the dead zone circle was added. However, the dead zone circle does have issues. Here we're using the previous version of HardOps, so for this I'm just going to go under Mesh Tools and just click on Radial Array to create a radial array. And now we have a radial array, which is a different type of array. As we see, it's a array, but it also uses an empty as a driver for dealing with the displacement. So that means if we press Q and we go under array, everything's fine here. We're able to roll the wheel and actually adjust things, and that's actually great. But the moment that we break the circle, things get out of control and we start actually displacing the array itself, which isn't the way that we should deal with radials. But the whole goal is to be able to adjust all sorts of arrays inside of Array V2, even if they're not the type of arrays that are typically associated with V2. So I'm just going to select this empty and press X and delete that, and we'll just create a new shape, and we'll shift it to live and just put an array on it. And this time I'm going to press Shift E in order to exit with an empty target. And this means that now I have an empty target that I can move afterwards to further adjust the array in case I want to adjust the distance more precisely, dealing with snapping systems that are unassociated with array, like edge snapping and vert snapping. If I want to snap this particularly here or along this edge or something like that. However, if you were to select this object and go back in to adjust your array, the first thing you notice is that your empty is gone. And we did our best to attempt to keep the distance that you had specified by the empty, but the fact that the empty is gone means that once you exit this, there's no way to properly adjust it in the way that you were able to previous. So that's one way that you can have an issue with array and dealing with Array V2 on a relaunch. Another way is we'll bring in another box and let's just create an array. And for this one, we're just going to press E, which gives us a different type of empty driver. This driver allows us to rotate it in order to adjust the count. It also allows us to move it back and forth, but the best part is that it also places it at the end of the object. And it's just using driven parameters to adjust the empty. And what I mean by driven parameters is that everything is purple, meaning that it's getting its differences based off things that are happening with this particular empty. So this also means that if we press Q and we go into array v2, that everything just breaks down. We're able to adjust the count, and that's great, but we've lost our empty, and so that's something I consider a bit of an issue. So here, let's bring up the current version of HardOps, and we'll just press Control N, make a new file. And using Boxcutter, we'll just create a quick box and press Q, go into array, roll our will, and let's just press E and exit with an empty driver. And typical scenario, I showed it just previously. If we press Q and we decide to adjust it, we see that the empty still disappears, and that's because you're using a driven empty in order to go in and try to adjust array settings, which just isn't going to play. In fact, this type of empty isn't actually adjusting the array parameters like you were seeing before where they were all purple. This one actually just places an empty in the offset field, which is a very simple way to deal with array targeting. But for this type of system, you can go in and actually adjust the array, and we see that it doesn't actually destroy the empty. But if we were to go inside, adjust the array, and press E to get a regular empty, we see that it's not only in the wrong place, but it's also placed on the other side of the object. But it also gives us a level of control that we didn't have previously, because we're now able to rotate adjusting, just showing the level of functionality goes with this. If we select this shape and we adjust it, well, now we see that we actually lost one of our empties. So let's press V, bring this object back out, and we'll just press E and set up our example properly. E again, there we go. Now we have our empty. So this one's the previous empty I was discussing, the one where when you rotate it actually adjusts the count in between. This one is the one that's actually driving all the parameters of this particular array. So that means if you go inside of it, we are going to remove all of that stuff because it's a driven object. You should be adjusting it from object mode, not inside of array v2. But if we were to press Shift E and actually exit with our target empty, you know, the much simpler version, you now will be able to go inside and actually adjust the count, and it won't destroy your empty. And this goes a step further too. Let's select this and the empty and delete it and create a new object. And for this one, we are going to just radial array it. And so radial array was one of those things I was showing previously where we would actually destroy it. Now you can actually load array v2, and when you're inside the dead zone circle, you are able to roll the will and adjust the count, and it won't actually destroy the radial array or mess with any of its parameters. But the moment that you jump outside the circle, it is going to begin changing things. So keep that in mind, of course. But just letting you know that there has been improvements made with dead zone circle and its behavior with doing destruction while you're inside the circle. We're trying to actually reserve that sort of behavior for when you're outside of the circle. When it comes to HardOps and getting around, pressing Control tilde will bring up the HardOps helper where there's options pertaining to workflow, your objects, constraints, and your modifiers. The modifiers is the area that we'll be talking about today. 2 new icons have been added. Smart Apply. In addition to that, also toggle modifiers has been added, where now users will be able to select their objects, go inside their modifier helper, and choose Smart Apply if needed, or toggle their modifiers off and on the fly. In previous versions of HardOps, we introduced a new version of scrolling called Everscroll, where basically if we hover over it, we can see the tooltip where clicking it activates for booleans, shift click for modifiers, control click for children objects, and alt click for Smart Apply. If we general click it, we can roll through modifiers, pressing A for select modifiers that we want to enable. And then there's even a more expanded mode where you can press tab and actually go into an interactive window where you can actually adjust certain modifiers, apply certain modifiers. You can even apply ranges of modifiers, even the modifiers leading up to them, in order to ensure that they get applied, and even right click to cancel. However, when it comes to our different UIs, normally when you first load it, you'll be put in something called the fast UI, which is based off of hotkeys and just generally just getting through it very quickly. However, if you press tab, we see that we jump into what was formerly called the expanded UI, and this is what's actually being replaced in this version. So some of the issues that we had with it was its dynamic scalability and just not being able to have a whole lot of control over its look to actually look as good as we want it to. Also, to help being scalable didn't help. It was just a couple of things that we wanted to just reapproach with it. So now if we look at the current version of HardOps, we could select this object, and if we just go under operations and modifier scroll, we're now inside of modifier scroll, and we see that there's only one modifier on this object, so that's why they're not giving me a lot of options. And same thing with this thing. I think I applied everything in this file. Alright, this one has a few modifiers, so let's look at what we have here. We see that we're looking at our list and we're able to scroll through it. We have our general help over on the side. But if we press tab, we now expand into what's called the .ui. So the .ui has been showing up on several other modals that we have inside of HardOps, allowing for user input. And for this, it actually gives the added bonus of instant tooltip support, where as you hover over it, you'll see tooltips actually let you know what's about to happen whenever you're clicking on it. Let's actually press Control N and create a new file. And let's go into this in depth. So one of the other things we wanted to improve with this was the ability to deal with recursive boolean. So here I'm cutting a cutter. So basically if I select the main object and I begin scrolling, it's only going to scroll through one cutter because that's the only modifier that's seen. If we press tab, we actually are able to look at this in the full .ui, but we also see that the number is clickable, meaning that if we click it, we will enter the recursive scroll of that particular object, which we found to be a little more intuitive. Now by rolling the wheel, we're able to go through and actually see all the booleans that actually build up that particular shape that we're looking at before. In the event that we want to lock its visibility, all we have to do is just click on the line to turn it into an eyeball, and then from there we're able to enable them to be visible. We could choose N, go back to our main one, click on the shape in order to append it to visibility, and let's also lock its visibility as well. And by clicking and applying, we now have enabled visibility on all the associated booleans associated with this particular object. So we just want to make that process a lot easier, but most importantly, we wanted the new UI to look familiar to users who had become acquainted to the previous UI. So instead of being able to stretch it and warp it, you'll notice that now it's just a little bit more controlled. So let me take a moment to load a more complicated file. Alright, this particular model will be a good example, so we'll select it and then press Q and jump into Everscroll. And we see that because everything's white, we can't really see a whole lot, but let's just press tab to open the .ui. And we see that all the recursive booleans are actually highlighted on the side, allowing us to actually click into them and begin scrolling through them, and even press N to go back to them previous. So the recursive boolean workflow is something that I want to ensure that users are able to get acquainted with quite easily. But even more so, even if you're not a big fan of the fast UI and you want this to load up into this particular .ui, there are also preferences available for that. So let's right click and cancel, and if we press Control K, we can bring up the HardOps preferences. Let's jump over to the HardOps side and let's look at our properties. So we see that instead of having the scroll UI offer the options of showing in expanded, we now have the option to show the UI in dot. So let's enable that. And if we want to keep it, let's click on the three lines and choose Save Preferences. And now when we press Q and we bring up Everscroll, we actually load directly into this .ui, and we can just begin scrolling through the booleans to find which booleans it is that we want to bring back. All the classics are still there. You're still able to just click on one of the names in order to see a wire display of which particular boolean that you're about to adjust before you even go in and toggle its visibility. But just letting you know that all the same functionality is there, and that all we sought to do with this particular update was just improve its ability to be conveyed to users. I mean, in this case, I'm using a rather simply shaded object, which kind of makes everything look just a little bit better. But just letting you know that there's been a significant amount of work done to this modifier and the way that you'll be able to go through and deal with your models with it. Also, you can still roll the wheel over the title in order to change which type of scrolling you're doing. So here I'm jumping between modifiers, children, and booleans. Here we'll drop ourselves off at modifiers, where we're starting off on an unmodified state of the mesh, similar to previous. But whenever we click to begin our auto scroll, we see that the number is no longer floating out in the screen as it did in the previous UI. It's now showing inside of the UI. So now we see that we're able to go through our Everscroll. We still have the behaviors of being able to roll the wheel in order to adjust the interval time. Sometimes when you're using exact booleans, you want to increase the interval time to ensure that they each come in fluidly while you're playing through the animation, like you see me doing here. But for the most part, there hasn't been a lot of changes with it, aside from just making everything a little bit more cosmetically sane with the similar look that we've been going about with all the rest of our modifiers inside of HardOps. Another thing is, whenever you're inside of modifier scroll, we see that on the finalize button that there's additional options. We see that you can shift click to smart apply clone. You can control click to apply visible modifiers, which is similar to what you're seeing in help in the bottom right corner, but we also added that same functionality. So you see, if I hold shift, we have an option to basically apply it on a duplicate, and if we hold control, we have the option to apply it with an A or for applying visible modifiers. We also took care to ensure that these sort of behaviors aren't available inside of any of the other modes because it is a modifier scroll exclusive behavior. There still are some delineations that need to be had with our various types of scrolls in order to allow them to go on their own paths, but just letting you know that there's been a significant facelift with the functionality that's been afforded to you with Everscroll, and we'll continue on our path to making it better and better. One of my favorite features with Everscroll is the ability to apply a range of modifiers. For example, we see that this object has a ton of modifiers and that applying each of them would require that I select it and press Control A, but there is no way for me to basically box select them all and apply them at the same time. However, that would be kind of cool. So that's where something like Everscroll comes in. So if we select this and we jump into Everscroll, we can just jump over and scroll this over to modifiers and basically roll it to the point that we desire, and then either press Control and apply, and that will apply all the modifiers to that point and then activate the ones that remain. Or we can jump inside this once again, and we could even hold Shift and click on the checkbox to apply to a certain range. And there's been work done to make sure the list is able to dynamically adjust as you're actually adjusting these modifiers on the fly. And the best part is you can experiment with applying modifiers, and let's say I didn't want to actually keep these changes, I can just right click and cancel, and we see that we're at the state that we were at previous. And I can press Q, jump into Everscroll once again, click on this, jump to modifiers, and we can just begin applying swaths of modifiers just all at the same time. And at the bottom of the screen, it'll show a display letting us know how many modifiers are actually being applied, and even tell us which modifiers are being applied in these particular cases, allowing us to get that very particular apply workflow going. So whenever it comes to Mapscroll, all you have to do is have an object selected, and by pressing Alt-M, you have the option for Mapscroll in your menu. However, if it's grayed out, more than likely that means that it hasn't yet been configured. So if we press Control-K and we go inside our preferences, you can see under Paths, under the Properties area, that you can specify your Maps folder. So I'll just paste in the Maps folder that I'm currently using, and that should do it. So now we actually have some tile maps. Another thing is for Mapscroll, you can actually specify what type of maps that you're scrolling through. Another thing important to note is that if you have this set to something that isn't actually present, like for example, I know I don't have any BMPs. If I were to select this object and begin doing a map scroll, we see that we're not able to actually scroll through any. And we've actually added an option as well for users to have to change their filter type by going inside their preferences in order to curtail some of these issues. Another thing worth noting is, even though we're in the previous version of HardOps, notice that the options that we have are PNG, JPEG, BMP, and TIFF. And so now let's actually load up the current version of HardOps, and by pressing Control-K we can go into the same area, and let's look at our map scroll, and we see that we now have a new option for PNG-JPEG. By enabling this, you'll now be able to go on map scroll, and just by pressing E, I'm just going through random maps, but now I'm actually able to load up JPEG maps in addition to PNG maps randomly. I recently bought a pack of JPEG maps just to test out and see if we could get to the bottom of some user reported issues, and it turned out that having an option to actually just scroll through multiple different types of maps would probably work best. So let's right click and cancel, and if we press Control-K as the finale, we also have an option to scroll through all types of maps. So basically, by enabling this, you're able to scroll through all types of images and load them up as in regards to Mapscroll. But keep in mind that it is working in a series of nodes that are taking these textures and converting them to grayscale. So I see some people having their Mapscroll folder filled with normal maps and stuff like that. Those are not yet supported inside of Mapscroll. We'll have to see what it looks like for our future with that, but just letting you know that when it comes to grayscale images, we now support all image types, and it can now be enabled inside of your preferences. So now we'll just go back to our viewport, go inside of Mapscroll, press E a couple of times to bring up random maps. We could press Tab, bring up the .ui. We can even shift click on our roughness to look at the roughness exclusively and get in and adjust it intimately by adjusting the parameters that are connected via the group nodes to it. And even just scrolling over it will take us back to just looking regular, and we can see what the result looks like. We can enable normal and even drag the normal negatively in this update, which was something we couldn't do previously, and even drag it back and forth through the negatives and the positives, which was something a little bit of a conundrum, but I'm glad that we finally got that added. 987_12 introduces a new option called set origin, and its purpose is to use the power of dots but to set origin. So here I'm holding control and rolling dots in Boxcutter, and one of the things I've always thought about using Boxcutter was how cool it would be to actually use dots in order to place the origin. However, dots can also be a little variable, so if we right click the shape and we subdivide it a couple of times, we now have more dots everywhere, which will make the following examples a little bit more tricky. So using Boxcutter, we're just going to jump over to line box, and I'm going to perform a cut, and now we have sliced out this area with line box. And the thing is what if I wanted to set an origin on this object locally without having to apply everything? Of course, I could let's just Shift D, go in local mode, and pretend that we were applying this. So let's Smart Apply, and from here let's Shift S, origin to geometry. Let's press Alt X and mirror, and we see that that's what we're getting for our origin. So let's press our buddy Control comma in order to bring about our origin, and let's try to rotate this thing in order to fit the edge, which we see that we're probably going to have to eyeball this thing to really get it to work just like we would want to. And this is kind of where I found that there was something for us to actually improve in Blender, was the ability to create localized transformation based on these sort of scenarios. So let's just delete that, and we're back to this object being in a non-destructive state. So let's go under Mesh Tools and choose Set Origin. So normally I would be clicking on the dot in the center of this and making that happen, but because I added additional geometry, I wanted to make it a little bit more tricky. And so there's a couple of ways we could go about this. We could right click and cancel. We could go under Add Modifiers and put a Decimate modifier, which will clean the geometry, and then we can go back under Mesh Tools and Set Origin. We can set our origin precisely right here, but whenever we press Alt X, we're experiencing the same issue as before. So that's where you would want to go under Set Origin, but instead of actually clicking the dot, you want to drag the dot down to the origin that you want to specify for the rotation. So now if we press Alt X, we see that we're able to mirror this, and it fits inside the same bounds without sticking out. So that is how easy it is for Set Origin to actually assist you in your workflow of setting localized origins. So let's set up a trickier case. So I've been actually doing this example quite a bit just in preparation of this particular demo. So now we have this shape, and let's go into Set Origin, and we want to set our origin, but we can't get a center dot, and there's no Decimate modifier that can do that. Of course, we could remove certain modifiers from the calculation by playing with what modifiers are being enabled via Modifier scroll, but that's a bit excessive. And this is where we can actually drag from one corner dot to another, but instead of it using the orientation that's being specified by the red dot, let's press F and specify that dot for the middle. But also, we're not done yet. This is just setting up the location of the object. Let's hold Shift and keep it live because the rotation isn't actually applicable. Let's click and drag on this area, creating a straight line, and let's just press R in order to set only the rotation. And once we applied, we now have the rotation happening on this object correctly. And so while we can't mirror this because this object is actually part of a more complex area, we can say use Boxcutter and its localized mirror to mirror cut across this thing. So I'm just pressing 1 and 2 on the keyboard in order to mirror across these areas, and now I'm able to actually continue working. In fact, in order to prevent myself from having to do it over and over, let's set our start state to be in mirror, and now I'm able to work on this object locally despite it being a very unique cutout. And so this is what the workflow is all about, is because in Boxcutter and HardOps, we never had a solution for dealing with localized geometry and at least mirroring across it. So this is definitely a big step forward. In fact, let's draw a box across this. And we could, of course, be using empties for targeting of the mirror and stuff like that in order to get it to point across. But this is definitely a much more intuitive way to work. So let's set ourselves up again. Let's actually turn off mirror, and we'll just Alt scroll over to line box. And we'll just create a line box here, press X. And so just to show the workflow of using Set Origin, let's just go under Mesh Tools, and we can click and drag from the first dot to the second. If we look at the bottom, we're setting the location of rotation. I'll press F in order to set our location at least be to median. And really, it doesn't matter if we set the rotation because I'm going to hold Shift so I can reuse it a second time. and I'm just going to drag from one dot to another dot and press R in order to adjust only the rotation. Only one press of R needed to jump to rotation, and we're able to quickly set the rotation. And so now, in order to test ourselves, let's go back inside of Boxcutter, start cutting on the right axis, of course, and we see that everything is working exactly as it would be expected, and we're able to continue cutting across this piece despite having very localized orientation going with it. I mean, of course, we could orient and work each side one by one, but being able to mirror across these sort of scenarios via origin reconfiguration is just something that I feel hasn't been done by us yet. So I'm very excited about this aspect. So like I said, with this particular object, we could just go under set origin, and just by dragging from here to here, this object is already set and it's already mirrored because this was, I believe, our first example. So that means if we turn off mirror inside of Boxcutter and we start cutting, we should see our shape on the side that, you know, this was our first example, so I forgot which side we actually set up our mirroring on, but we're not even having to use the internal mirroring. So whenever you're dealing with faces like this that aren't particularly clipped out like we're seeing in the second and third examples, it's actually a lot easier to deal with. And so to really drive the point home, one more time, we'll jump over to line box and we'll just bring up a shape. And let's actually bring up a shape that is going to be really hard to solve. I mean, I've just been bringing up worse and worse cases for us to have to solve when it comes to dealing with our orientation. So for this one, I guess I would need one corner inside, and we'll slice it. And so let's select this object and let's set our origin. So I'm going to select the farthest corner on the back, one of the corners on the front, because that's all we have. We'll press F to set our origin to the middle, but we'll hold shift to keep it live. And we're just going to drag from one of these dots to another dot to indicate the rotation while pressing R to set the rotation. And once we release, we now have our rotation set. And you can test it by just goofing off with the mirroring like you see me doing there. Sometimes I'll just mirror it just to see if everything worked out properly. I mean, once you press alt text, just seeing the gizmo pop up will kind of give you a little bit of a clue. So now let's press D, jump over to box, and we'll jump back over to mirror. And while we didn't specify explicitly which side is our, X prime, you could usually figure it out by cutting and running into mistakes in this particular workflow. However, in a future update of Boxcutter, we will be introducing a new panel to kind of streamline the experience and make things a lot more simple for new users who are trying to get acquainted with these things, because mirror is definitely a lot different in HardOps than it is in Boxcutter, and there are some steps we can take to make that a little bit easier for users. So more on that in the future, but for now, we're talking about HardOps and the new set origin feature. So here we are, just setting our origin and placing our cuts, and even with a portion of a shape, we were still able to get this thing done. So, let's have a little fun. Let's first turn off mirror, because when you cut on the wrong side, when you have mirror enabled and you're not aware of the settings that are actually in place, like for me having both X and Y enabled, it can definitely stand in your way. So here I am cutting off a slice. Let's say we wanted to make this piece some sort of rotation piece. Well, first let's uniquify it, which means that now this piece has unique booleans allowing me to just rip it away. But also we can go under set origin and just grab a dot and point it where we want it to go, and this is now where we'll be rotating it. So there's a lot to set origin. However, we wanted users to be with us on this journey as we take it to its final level. So I hope y'all will definitely find some use out of the V1. There's been a lot of cases that we tested with this to ensure those definitely of use, but definitely my favorite is being able to just simply draw a shape similar to this, slice it out, and just quickly go under set origin and just grab a dot and set my origin. However, in this case, we need to drag this dot to this dot, press F, and that will set the rotation as well, meaning we don't have to hold shift, but when we mirror it, we see that we fall short. So how do we get past this? Well, I will just hit it with a decimate, and then we can go in and actually set the origin, grab this dot, drag it here, and whenever we mirror it across, we see that there is no overlap issues happening, indicating that our operation was performed successfully. However, of course, we're going to cut on the wrong side of this, causing us to have to transform the shape. But thankfully we have transformation, and we just start getting working on this particular localized aspect. So there's still a lot more whenever it comes to this aspect, but this is just the beginning of us talking about setting origins inside of HardOps. So just keep in mind that if you're trying to locate in Q menu, it's just as easy as having a selection, going under your mesh tools and choosing set origin, and from there you're launched into the modal. There's also some additional behaviors that have been taken into account. For example, with this object we have a pretty weird shape. We could decimate it like I've been showing, but another way that I've been dealing with origins is pressing QOT, which will give us a box, and then I'll press Shift W in order to make it a wireframe, and then I just scale it out a little bit, select both shapes, and then I go under set origin, and I just set origin using the box. And from here I can delete the box, and this object is definitely mirrored to the best of its ability based on the bounce of the shape, as we can see it not flexing here inside of this shape with Z fighting whenever we mirror it. But if we wanted to actually cut across it and keep the asymmetry going, then that is where the mirror modifier is going to come in. And of course, make sure that you cut responsibly by beginning on the proper side. And when it comes to mirror inside of Boxcutter, 1, 2, 3 turns it off and on. Shift 1, 2, and 3 will flip the axis for X, Y, and Z appropriately. And of course, keep in mind, whenever it comes to our hotkeys, we have them listed in our end panel. But just like that, we were able to use set origin to allow us to quickly work this area with the degree of symmetry that normally wouldn't be afforded to us by just relocating the origin and actually setting it correctly. And hopefully this is giving you some ideas on some creative cases you can use to actually get the most out of set origin, and also use secondary objects to specify your origins for either both or your primary objects. So one of the things that's always been a little bit difficult to deal with in Blender was origin and setting up origins, and so I started to get a little creative with how I was personally dealing with origins. To just kick this example off, I'm just going to Shift D, duplicate this cube, select them both, select difference, press F9, and we're going to change this to an inset. But we're also going to change it to an inset slice and just lower the thickness a little bit. So if we press 1 in order to turn off collection 2, we can select this object in numpad / to look at this in local mode, and you see that this is just a slice. And if we press H to hide it, you see that it left a nice little area underneath. So basically for this object, I would need the origin to actually go to this area in order for me to continue on with this the way that I would like to play with it. So a fun hotkey in Blender is pressing Control and comma to turn on the origin. And with this, you can actually press G and translate it. And I'll press Control Shift Tab, and we will jump on edge, and I'll press G, and we're just going to snap it to this edge. And we could press Control comma to turn that off, and we're now able to rotate it. But we see that, you know, because it's a boolean, and because it's a complex boolean at that, we need to press Q and uniquify in order to make this operation something that we can manipulate. And so now we've actually set up this object able to be manipulated. And so, you know, that process wasn't so bad, but, you know, let's continue with it. So I'm just going to Shift right click, place my mouse here, and we will bring about this shape, and we'll select them both, choose difference, press F9, change it also to an inset. Sometimes I'm just really lazy, I'll just F9 my way to an inset, and we will inset slice this as well. And let's select this object, press Control period, and because I've done this so much, I actually have gotten pretty fast at it, and we'll just snap this origin to this location. And let's just press Control comma to turn that back off. We'll press Q, go under operations, uniquify, and now this object is able to flap up. So we have these objects that are going to be able to keep flapping up because we've sliced them to do so. And so that's really kind of the foundation behind my relationship with dealing with origins. However, in some cases I would actually perform a cut. Let's just turn this into a slice, and in order to get my origin exactly where I would want, I would just go under operations, shift click smart apply, and under the smart apply clone, just select the edge, snap the cursor there, delete it, select this object, Shift S, origin to cursor, and then from there I can uniquify and continue on with my onslaught. So there's multiple ways for us dealing with origin. In fact, Shift S is one of my favorite ways of dealing with origin, and by no means we're attempting to replace that, but just letting you know kind of what it's like dealing with origins in Blender just on the fly, and just kind of our starting point, or at least from how I see it. So we'll just do it one more time. For this object, we'll do it the classic way where we press Control comma to enable this baby, and we'll just snap it there, and Control comma to get rid of that, and we'll uniquify it, and now we have this piece able to also rotate out. And so, you know, just to knock the demo out early, let's have some fun with this. So I'm going to Shift A, add an empty, and we want to press Control tilde, and in our helper we have our object settings, so I'm just going to turn on in front because we don't want to lose sight of our empty, but I don't want to move it from where it is. And so with this object, let's just add a constraint. I love constraints. Constraints are one of my favorite things in Blender to play with. I just give it a little bit of time, and every time it teaches me something new. And so we want to map the location from Z, maybe 0.2 to 0.3 on the Z, and we want to map it to the rotation based on the Z, so we don't need any other axes enabled. Notice that these dark out, and let's just raise our empty. And for this object, we probably want to rotate it on the X. So we see that because our empty is already rotated, we're able to move it. And so now we've basically have set this up. So we now set up our first layer of movement. Let's move this up, and let's select this object, but this time we're going to make it easier. We'll select both of these, choose copy constraints to select it. And so now we've copied this constraint, but the way that we copied it isn't going to actually work out. So instead of rotating it on the, I guess, X, everything's Z to me now, Z vision, we're going to rotate it on the Y, and we're going to change it from 0.3 to 0.4. And so now we have this system where basically this will rotate, then this will rotate, just really having some fun with it. And now for this object, because we've set our origin, we can select it, select this object. Notice that the selection order is reverse of booleans, just one of those Blenderisms. Sometimes the selection order is just different, but that's just Blender. So let's actually raise this from 0.4 to 0.5, and let's see what we're looking at. And we see that this actually rotated backwards. So we'll select this, home, minus 180 to make it negative. And let's try that again. And this is where we are so far. So continuing with this object, we'll select this object, and you know, just throwing it back to a classic, and we see that it rotated the opposite direction. So let's remove the negative, and let's bring it down again. And we actually want this other piece to rotate last. So we look at this, we're at 0.4, 0.5. We'll change this from 0.5 to 0.6. It's like a imaginary timeline that I'm keeping up with in my head as I'm dealing with this stuff. And so now I can actually lower it, and that is basically the result. So I've been doing a lot of randomness on Twitter, just kind of tweeting out about just, you know, randomness happening inside of Blender. But let me introduce you guys to set origin, just a really quick introduction. Let's just take a shape, press E, we'll slice that off, right? And let's decide where we want to set our origin, probably here. We press Q, go under our options for set origin, and click, and done. And we also want to uniquify this piece, of course, but now we can actually rotate that piece out. So let's select this piece, select a piece similar, and let's see how it looks so far. And we probably want to actually rotate this piece last. So this one will go from 0.7 to 0.8. And admittedly, this can definitely get a bit confusing. So I try to do these actually in one sitting while my brain's really on top of it, because otherwise I'll start getting caught up in the arbitrary number ranges. But it really is so fun watching it come together when you're playing with it. So to just wrap up this small section of the demo, in the latest Blender, they actually added the ability to add a grease pencil object, which I was using these and just putting modifiers on it, but they actually have collection line art. And when you click on this, it actually will give you a line art actually associated with your collection already. So if we Shift A, add a camera, and we put our camera back, we actually have the object already in view just like we would like. And so when it comes to rendering these things, I've just been putting them on flat, setting my viewport to be white. There's a whole slew of questions I have about their renderability and how to get them to F12 properly, but you know, that's a talk for another day, and I don't want to show that part while I'm struggling in the video itself. But let's look for occlusion, range, and usually playing with the range will help me get where I want it, but looks like we also got to raise the angle a little bit. And I've been slightly changing up my workflow on this every time because, you know, there's really no right or wrong way to do it, but it's definitely a little fun getting better results every time you try. In fact, let's start playing with our occlusion. I feel like it should be doing something in this case. If we go too high, start showing us absolutely everything geometrically, but I'm just wondering why it's not showing us all the little corners of all the line art. So let's select an object, tap into edit mode, come back out, grab this object, and as we move it, we see everything flip into place. We could also adjust the color and the shading because right now everything's really flat looking on this white background. And so now when we lower it empty, this is the result that we're getting. Of course, turn off gizmo display. Voila. And that's how you would set something like that up. Just a small 10-minute detour. Sorry about that, but we got it done in a timely fashion. In closing, I just want to say that I'm thankful for everyone's continued support and usage of the products, and without your suggestions and well wishes, the tools would definitely not continue even as long as they have been. So with that, I hope that users get out of here and are setting up origins and having fun with some of the new additions in HardOps, and we'll continue on refining and making adjustments, and I can't wait to show you the next thing that we have planned for HardOps. So with that, I'll close this video and I'll see you guys next time.